Okay, I guess we're at noon. So let me go ahead and welcome everyone who's here. I'm really happy to have a big turnout. And so thank you for coming to the Friday seminar. I'm Amanda Thompson. I'm a CPC fellow. I'm a professor in the departments of anthropology and nutrition. And it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Craig Hadley today. He's a professor in the Department of Anthropology at Emory University. He received his PhD in anthropology from the University of California, Davis, and during that had a special emphasis in international nutrition, so also worked with the program in international nutrition at UC Davis. After finishing his PhD, he was a Mellon Fellow in Anthropological Demography at Brown University, and then a Robert Wood Johnson Health and Society Scholar with Social Epidemiology and Population Health at the University of Michigan. So he's coming to us with a really fantastic interdisciplinary background, which he also brings to his research. So his research focuses on the social and cultural production of health and really combines in new and exciting ways anthropological demography, population studies, public health nutrition, and population health. So things that are really of interest to students and faculty here at the CPC. His research has been funded by NSF, NIH, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, among others. He's published in a wide range of both social science and health science journals. And much of his recent research focuses on food insecurity, and actually a lot of his whole kind of history of research focuses on food insecurity and its relation to mental health, which is something that the rest of the field is sort of just catching up with now, and that will be the topic of his talk today. So thank you so much for joining us. Let me just get the mechanics out of the way really quickly, which is, if you have a question, we're going to hold questions until the end. And if you have a question that you'd like me to read, go ahead and type it in the Q&A and I will get your question read. If you have a question that you feel comfortable asking, just type your name into the chat and your mic will be, well, you'll be given permission to unmute your mic. And so then you can unmute yourself and ask your question. So take it away, Craig.
All right, well, thanks, Amanda. Thanks for that introduction. And thank you for all those people in their squares for coming to yet another Zoom meeting, and this one on a Friday afternoon. I'll try to shorten this a tiny bit so that perhaps it's a little easier. Unless you're using this as a chance to hide away from homeschooling your kids, that might be a little less painful, but I'll shorten it up. So yeah, thank you so much for the introduction to talk here at UNC. This is it's truly an honor, given CPC's wonderful programs and faculty and all the work they're putting out. And students, I just wanted to publicly acknowledge that Caroline Owens is a student that came to Emory from UNC. She's been instrumental in lots of the work we've been doing in Ethiopia recently, and she is just a simply outstanding student scholar, and just you should be very proud at UNC that she's come here to be an ambassador. It's really, she's fantastic. So, okay, so today I'm going to talk about food insecurity and mental health, and probe the role that culture might play in explaining the association that we see. And in general, what I'm trying to do is to think about how we can take meaning more seriously in these studies of food insecurity. And I got to admit, this is somewhat a simple and somewhat unsatisfying talk because the results are not what we had expected. And to be honest, we're still trying to make sense of what sense they make. And so hopefully in the Q&A, someone can help us a little bit. So with that, let me start. So this is a talk about food insecurity or food security. So I'll just start with a definition so we're all on the same page. And this is emerging as a consensus definition or close to that. And that's simply that food security is when a household is considered food secure, when it can reliably gain access to food in sufficient quality and quantity for all household members to enjoy an active and healthy life. And this definition calls attention to sort of three kind of key dimensions. One is this reliably. This is, you know where your food's going to come from tomorrow, the next day, etc. And then there's this issue of quantity, which is probably universally accepted to indicate something about energy availability. And then there's this issue of quality, which for public health nutritionists probably triggers something about micronutrients or perhaps dietary diversity. But for social scientists, it's probably cueing something more along food preferences or socially acceptable foods. Now, over the last 2 decades, there's been tremendous energy and work and honestly debate over how to measure food insecurity. This has been a key line of research for lots of people. And there's been some convergence around the idea that we can use experience-based scales to ask respondents directly about their experience rather than relying on proxy indicators for food insecurity. And this approach has led to a number of tools that are used to measure food insecurity, including the HFIAS, the Household Food Insecurity Access Scale, and the FAO's FIES, or Food Insecurity Experience Scale. And the way these tools work is simply by asking respondents about their experience. And they're generally 8 or 9 questions long, and they start with questions like, were you just worried about having enough food? And they move down to more severe things like, did you have to skip a meal? Maybe your household ran out of food. To more severe indicators of food insecurity, like you had to go the whole day without eating. And these tools now are widely used, and there's some pretty nice data sets, and some of these have been integrated into things like DHS. And they give us a sense for the global epidemiology of food insecurity. And that's been nicely shown, excuse me, in a recent paper by Michael Smith and colleagues in World Development, where they use this new data set using the FAO's Food Insecurity Experience Scale to look at the global epidemiology of food insecurity in 134 countries with tens of thousands of respondents. And what they show is that about 27% of their respondents are food insecure. But when you break that down by high income and low income settings, you find that in high income settings, about 10% of respondents are food insecure. And in low income settings, it's about 56, or well, more than half. And this gives some indication about what a tremendously large problem this is, not just globally, but particularly in low and middle income settings. Now, anthropologists have had a really long interest in food insecurity, and their interest traditionally has been in looking at household coping strategies and food insecurity and ways in which households smooth consumption, and then to have tried to assess the impacts of that on kids and adults, but mostly children's nutritional status. But building off of ethnographic work in 2006, Crystal Patil and I decided to see if there might be a mental cost to food insecurity as well. And what we wanted to see is if coping with food insecurity might keep children's nutritional status above water, but exact some sort of mental health cost. And we showed that was the case in Tanzania, and we've since followed up with a number of studies. And they generally show something like this. This is from data from a project we did in Ethiopia. And this is 2,000 households in rural Ethiopia, in which we showed that the symptoms of prevalence of high symptoms of mental disorder are substantially greater in food insecure households than in food secure households. And that maintains when we control for things like age and education, water supply, et cetera. So this general extension to the model from biocultural anthropology suggests that coping strategies can exact a physical cost, or food insecurity can exact a physical cost, but a mental cost as well. The idea that food insecurity, or that there might be a mental cost to food insecurity, has since then spurred an incredible amount of work. And since then, there have been several narrative reviews that have looked at the association between food insecurity and other variables that measure poverty and their effects on common mental disorders. And that was really nicely reviewed in 2010 by Crick London colleagues, who in their review highlighted the particular role of food insecurity as being a relatively consistent and strong correlate of common mental disorders. So they really pulled out that among the suite of poverty variables that have been used, food insecurity seems to be particularly potent predictor of common mental disorders. And that work has since continued to the point where now last year, or earlier this year actually, there's been some meta-analyses that have been put forth that have sort of taken the role of food insecurity and mental health and done these meta-analytic studies. This was just published in Public Health Nutrition, drawing across a bunch of different studies and showing that with some variation in how you measure food insecurity, there seems to be this really consistent association with risk of depression across studies. There's some heterogeneity across studies, which is probably interesting, but there still is this overall effect. And then more recently, in what was a terribly timed submission because it overlapped exactly with the one I just showed you. My student Anna Grace published a meta-analysis as well, Anna Grace Tribble, which showed the same thing and then extended it to anxiety as well. So this is where we're at in this relationship in the literature, I think, with food insecurity and mental health, which is that there is a very consistent relationship between these two things. That is really almost no matter how you measure food insecurity and almost no matter how you measure common mental disorders, namely anxiety and depression, these two things are associated. So where the field is at now, I think, is emerging, or what's emerging in the field now is what's driving this question. What is it that's so toxic about food insecurity for mental well-being? And my reading of the literature is that there's kind of two approaches that are emerging to try to answer this question. One is that food insecurity is driving mental well-being through something like a nutritional black box. Not entirely clear what that is. And in the literature, people refer to this in all kinds of different ways, like poor nutritional status. People call attention to poor quality foods, potentially limited macro and micronutrients. And the basic idea here is that food insecurity is eroding people's dietary quality, that's impacting their nutritional status, and through what is either explicitly or implicit, and there's some mechanism here that ultimately is impacting mental well-being. And so this is really calling attention to this kind of nutritional pathway linking these two. Now, that line of questioning, or that line of thinking has kind of been questioned or pushed back upon by a couple of other folks. There's a group of people who have tried to point out that, and really by doing these dietary cost analyses, they've tried to point out that actually in many places one can procure an inexpensive but nutritious diet for pretty cheap. So this is Esther Duflo's work on the Philippines, pointing out that someone there could meet their dietary, at least their caloric requirements for 21 cents a day, which they argue is quite affordable even for the ultra poor. And then they say the catch though is that you'd be eating, in this case, bananas and eggs. But it highlights, but it's beginning to highlight that perhaps there's something more than for food insecurity than just simply dietary quantity. There might be something about the kinds of foods that people are eating. And a lot of people have taken this idea that there might be, it's not, people aren't just trying to meet nutritional goals, but they might be trying to meet cultural goals as well, to push this second line of inquiry, which is really focused less on, is the diet enough or is it adequate, but is it right? Is it culturally correct? And what's the cost of consuming a culturally and nutritionally appropriate diet? So there's been a lot of papers recently that have really taken this on in all kinds of different ways, using different methods. Some using ethnography, some using sort of standard narrative reviews, and then a couple of papers by Nicole Darman and colleagues that have used linear programming to really attack this in a sophisticated way. And what they're essentially asking is, can one consume a nutritious diet at low cost? And they're often finding that yes, you can, but that diet does not seem to be culturally appropriate. So that suggests that one can potentially meet their nutritional goals, but not their cultural goals. This line of reasoning, too, has been supported by some randomized controlled trials in which the ultra poor are given money. And the assumption, at least what Banerjee and Duflo argue, is the assumption is people would use, if they're truly food insecure, they would use those funds to increase their dietary intake or perhaps have more nutritious diets. But what they find in at least some of those is that people instead buy kind of fancier goals, again, suggesting that they're using that income to meet a cultural goal rather than a nutritional goal. And this line of reasoning that again suggests that people are quite interested in meeting their cultural goals is backed up too by quite a bit of ethnographic work among cultural anthropologists. This is some work by Jessica Ham, who worked with food insecure women in Ghana. And in a lot of her work, she argues that in talking with women, it's clear that hunger or food insecurity is about more than access to calories. It's about the embodied emotional reaction to the disconnect between what is craved and what is consumed. In other words, there seems to be certainly this meaning, this kind of craving for meaning that some diets are not meeting. And so this kind of approach begins to shift our focus away from a focus on calories and micronutrients only to begin to focus on the meaning of food. And what it suggests potentially is that foods may have not only carry with them specific micronutrients and macronutrients, like we can take a piece of steak and figure out what's in it, but we might also be able to assess the something like the cultural content of that food as well. There might be specific meanings that come with particular foods, and those can become a marker of status, and people might then literally be embodying and consuming not only calories and micronutrients, but also specific cultural meanings. And what I think is interesting in reading the ethnographic literature is it's quite clear that's true not just for specific foods, but also how foods are consumed, and the ways in which food are consumed, what we call the culture of consumption, or excuse me, the context of consumption. And that may be quite culturally specific. And my favorite example of this comes from a study that was done, actually it's in the UK, with young people, trying to get them to figure out why they're not eating healthy foods. And in this study, the focus group moderator is talking with presumably a bunch of teenagers and is kind of trying to come up with some good, healthy eating ideas. And she pitches the idea of yogurt and says, like, of course, well, what about yogurt? It's portable, it's tasty, it's nutritious. And the response to that is, well, you'd look stupid getting a big metal spoon out of your bag to eat this. And so this has nothing to do with the yogurt. It is the act in which it's consumed, which suddenly makes it so that it's culturally inappropriate for a young person in the UK to eat this. So this is not about yogurt. This is about how it's consumed. So it suggests there's potentially the right kinds of foods to eat and the right ways to eat this food. And so central to this argument is that there are these cultural norms that are probably place specific about culturally correct foods and the right ways to eat them. And so this theoretical background then suggests that there might be a cultural link between food insecurity and mental well-being. And specifically, it may be the case that food insecurity leads people to shift away from foods that are considered to be desirable, preferred, or even normative, and to maybe shifts people's patterns of consumption or consumption-related behaviors away from those that are considered to be normative or cultural. That is, so you're getting this shift away from normative, culturally appropriate diets and behaviors. And this might then generate sort of a gap between what one can achieve and what's considered normative or culturally appropriate or correct. And this is a gap that Bill Dressler has referred to as low cultural consonance. That is, when someone is unable to achieve the normative dietary intake or behaviors in their culture, then they're not consonant, and so we have situations of low cultural consonance. And Dressler and others have shown that low cultural consonance is experienced as quite stressful, and it's been linked to higher psychological distress. But this raises the question then of, if this is a theory we want to explore, how do we actually go about measuring and quantifying this culture or this meaning? And this is where we've sort of struggled, and I'll just show you our best attempt to do this. And so we begin by taking Boyd and Richardson's cognitive definition of culture, which is that culture is information stored in individuals' brains that's capable of affecting behavior and that got there through social learning. So it's just stuff inside your brain, it's just information. And then we draw on Bill Dressler's conceptualization of culture as not being one big thing. It isn't sort of the classic Benedict anthropology where you can characterize an entire group of people by a single culture. Rather, we think about it as being not one thing, but a whole bunch of different cultural models. And we might try to assess what falls within each of these domains. So there might be culturally specific domains about mating patterns, what makes a good life, and relevant to this talk, how to eat, and the significance of food. In other words, we can imagine that what falls into each of these domains is culturally specific, and we can, as ethnographers and anthropologists and social scientists, try to uncover what falls into each of these buckets here. And what's important about this is that there might be almost entirely arbitrary things that fall into these, but as Dressler points out, what makes these arbitrary things have causal force is that we all agree that that's the way they are. So one way I like to think about this is we can agree on what things go into that, like probably should have thought of a better example before I got into this, but breakfast foods. Okay, we might all agree what are considered breakfast foods, and they might be cereal, milk, coffee, and donuts. And we also might agree on how those things are related to one another. So we might agree that we pour the milk into the cereal and drink the coffee and eat the donut, and we don't pour the coffee into the cereal and dunk the donut into the milk. Although there's really, I mean, according to Dressler, that's quite arbitrary. It may be quite delicious to pour coffee into your cereal and pour milk on a donut. I've never tried it because it's not the way we do things, but maybe it's actually perfectly delicious. So when we think about kind of measuring culture, we want to capture both what the things are and how things are related to one another. But importantly, we also, to be cultural, they need to be shared. We want to make sure that people in a particular group are agreeing that that's the way things are. And so that takes a couple of steps to do that. So we're trying to build here a theory of culture, and we need to identify the items and the meaning and that people attach to these different items. So in the study I'm going to talk about today, we tried to do this. We tried to explore these two different approaches that have been put forth to explain the association between food insecurity and mental well-being. And those kind of two approaches, or those two hypotheses, are a nutritional approach, or a nutritional pathway, and a cultural pathway. And I'll talk a little bit more about the cultural one because I think it's a little bit trickier of the two. So we hypothesize that maybe food insecurity impacts the cultural foods that are consumed, and specifically the cultural value of foods that are consumed, and it might impact on the culturally correct ways in which food are consumed. And that might be inherently stressful, which generates poor mental well-being. That is, people might be consuming foods that have low social value or negative valence, or they might be consuming foods in culturally inappropriate ways. And so we wanted to specifically test these two ideas, and then the nutritional hypothesis as well. Okay, and so the data for this come from two different sites in the world. One is Ethiopia, and specifically it's in Jimma, Ethiopia. And Jimma is about 350 kilometers southwest of Addis Ababa. And it is a kind of an emerging market town. There's a large university there. There's incredible foreign investment, primarily from China, like in many other places in Africa right now. There's paved roads, there's electricity, you can see there's a bustling market town there. This picture was taken a few years ago. There's large buildings in the background. So it's really emerging as this integrated, very energetic town. If you're familiar with Ethiopia, it is nothing like Bahadar or Awassa, which are 10 years ahead of Jimma, but it's on its way there. And then the other site where we're using data from is in Brazil. And this is my colleague Joe Weaver's field site. So I'm a little less, I haven't been here, I'm a little less familiar with this, but this field site is a small rural community in the Pará state. And it is about 45 minutes away from a major town on an unpaved road, although there's quite a bit of movement back and forth. And originally this was settled, and people were encouraged and given plots of land to engage in small-scale subsistence farming. But since the 1990s, people have really switched to either become cattle ranchers or to rely partially or fully on government subsidies and remittances. And there's been this big out-migration of young men primarily. So it's a very female, there's 600 households of which many of them are female-headed. So we have these two different sites that are quite different in many ways. One's a bit more rural, but both of them are somewhat integrated into markets and et cetera. Okay. And so what we wanted to do in each of these sites is to begin to kind of explore these two different perspectives, linking food insecurity and mental health. And the first, and what took up a lot of our work, was to try to to try to understand the cultural context of food here. That is, we wanted to kind of really explore the meaning piece of this theory. And so we began in each place doing qualitative, exploratory, and semi-structured work in which we tried to really develop a comprehensive understanding of the cultural significance of food and the cultural context of consumption. And the way we did this is we did interviews in each place with about 40 individuals. And these interviews consisted of things like free lists and semi-structured interviews. So in the free list portion, we might, for instance, have asked, not even for instance, we asked people to say, if a family is doing fine, they're not struggling, they're just they don't have any, they're not in poverty. What are the kinds of foods that they would be eating? Tell me about those foods. And then we asked about if a family's doing really well, they're quite successful, what are the kinds of foods that people are eating? If a family is struggling, what are some of the foods that people really desire, et cetera. So we began to build these lists that allowed us to kind of map out on a sort of a spectrum from prestigious to less prestigious, a bunch of different foods. And then we did semi-structured interviews in which we talked with people about, among other things, behaviors that are associated with eating. What are some things that people do when they're really struggling? What are some things that people do? What are some behaviors that seem to define people who are doing well? What are considered to be normative or ideal behaviors, et cetera. So we ended up with this large smorgasbord of foods and dietary behaviors. And then the next step we wanted to do is to see whether there was an agreement or a shared understanding about these. In other words, do people generally agree that some behavior is high status or low status or prestigious or not? And to do that, we culled down our list of foods and behaviors, and we bring them to a second sample of people. In Ethiopia, in both places, this was about 60 people. And what we did then is to present those individuals, not all 62 at once, but in individual face-to-face interviews. We gave them, in terms of pile sorts, we had them pile sort the foods into essentially from most prestigious to least prestigious. And then we did the same thing with dietary behaviors. We had our respondents rank and rate those. And then with those data, we performed a cultural consensus analysis. And a cultural consensus analysis, for those of you who are not familiar, is a technique that's widely used in cognitive anthropology these days. Sometimes it feels like you can't have a medical anthropology paper right now that doesn't have cultural consensus analysis in it, but it's a very popular technique. And it's really, one way to think about it is a factor analysis on people rather than on items. And what you're trying to do is to see to what extent are people agreeing in how they rate these items. And a common metric in this literature to assess whether there is intracultural agreement is if the ratio of the first and second eigenvalues are greater than 3. We won't go into the details of why that's the case, but it's sort of a standard metric to see whether you got consensus or not. And when we do this on the diet and the dietary behaviors variables, the ratios are in the 13s, 14s, and 15s. There's incredible agreement in both of these populations on the prestige value of different foods and on behaviors. And so let me just show you what that looks like here. So these are data, are some results from of our pile sorts here. This is for Ethiopia. And what this is showing is essentially the culturally agreed upon prestige ranking of that food, with 4 being the highest. So in Ethiopia, everybody agrees that raw meat or kitfo is the most prestigious food. And if you know much, if you've been to Ethiopia, you may know this. It's considered a very prestigious food. And then people rate chicken, but specifically prepared in a particular way. We won't get into the details of how that's prepared, but it's called dorowat. That's also very, very prestigious. Meat is high on the list, as it is in pretty much every survey that's ever been done on dietary preferences, and then you get butter and milk, etc. And people are ranking these as very prestigious, and importantly, they're agreeing on that. And we can go down the list. So macaroni is right here in the middle. You can see the Italian influence there in Ethiopia. shiro, this is kind of your classic lentils in Ethiopia, Ethiopian cuisine. And shiro is kind of widely considered to be like kind of everyday food and maybe even kind of a commoner or poor person food. If you had shiro every day, that would certainly be indicating something about your social status. And then down lower, we get things like gorre, which is a root crop. And root crops are sort of famous in anthropology for having low status no matter where they are. So these are very low status. Anyway, so we can agree, or we can, with some confidence, take these different foods and attach a prestige value onto them and show that people agree in that. That is, there's agreement that meat is a 3.8, for instance. And you can do the same thing in Brazil. Interestingly, lasagna comes out to be the most prestigious food in this particular setting, followed by coleslaw. You might immediately see there's some cultural specificity to this because you may not think that at all for yourself, but in this particular community, those are the hot items. And then down here, you get cassava, so root crops down here as well, and plain rice is at the very bottom. Now, the value of this is that it means that just like we can attach something like the caloric content to lasagna, we can also attach to it prestige value now. So we're essentially making an argument that calories and cultural meaning are invariant within one of these foods, that we can say that with some confidence. And we can also do that for dietary behaviors. So we can, we did some pile sorting activities with dietary behaviors. It's just a MDS, a multidimensional scale plot of these. And so we asked people to pile sort these different behaviors, again, that had been generated from qualitative work. And this is for Brazil, and this was the pile for behaviors that people did when they're struggling. So they buy small amounts of food. They don't have a lot of food at home. They don't eat bread in the morning. They use wood or charcoal for their cooking. So these are signaling something about the context of consumption. And again, there's incredible consensus across people in how these fall out along a sort of prestige / SES spectrum. And we can do that for Ethiopia as well. So this is the pile that represents sort of what people are aspiring towards, or the things people would like to do. And that would be to always use butter, and they're eating with spices, buying food from a supermarket. Those are considered to be fairly high prestige behaviors. And we can contrast those in Ethiopia with low prestige things like skipping meals, but sending your kids to the neighbors to potentially get food, begging for food, eating your holidays, spending your holidays alone, and buying at the market, not the supermarket, but sort of your traditional market just outside of town. So the point of all of this is that we can now, I think, characterize the social significance of what people eat and the social significance of how they're eating it. And then this leads us to a third phase of this project. You just see we're eating up research respondents here as we go through all these different samples. But we then take our results from this second phase and we do this population or this household level survey. And the idea here, so what we did here is we interviewed 200 households in Ethiopia and 200 households in Brazil. And they're remarkably well matched on some characteristics. Age, they're quite similar. Household size, they're generally 2 to 3 kids and 1 to 2 household heads. They're, as I said, it's a predominantly female sample in Brazil and predominantly female sample in Ethiopia. The Brazil is much more because of migration, out-migration of the men, and in Ethiopia it's much more because the time in which we interviewed, and we preferentially interviewed women because to match the Ethiopia sample. Okay, and then everybody in this sample responded to a 9-item food insecurity score or scale, and we scored them. So, and then to begin to collect some information to test the nutritional hypothesis, we collected information on arm fat area, so using tricep skin folds and arm circumference to calculate that, BMI, and anemia. And you can see that the Brazilian sample is a bit more robust than the Ethiopian sample. So arm fat area is quite a bit larger than Ethiopia. BMI is quite a bit higher. And anemia is quite a bit higher in Brazil than it is in Ethiopia. That's probably because, well, there could be a couple of reasons why that would be the case. But these give us some indication about the nutritional differences, both within and between the sample. And then finally, we have kind of our key outcome variable here, which is common mental disorders count. And here what we do, we're just using very standard scales. So for Ethiopia, we use the the State Trait Anxiety Inventory and the Center for Epidemiologic Studies Depression Scale, the CSD-8. You've probably seen or used these before in your work. And these have been translated into Amharic and Afan-Oromo and Portuguese. And we're making no diagnostic claims here whatsoever. Our assumption is simply that the higher you count on this, the more of these you endorse, the poorer your mental well-being is. And I think there's quite a bit of evidence to support that, but we certainly can't say anything about diagnostics here, which would be it's a much bigger undertaking to do that. Okay, so with the sample, one of the things, sort of the novel piece of all this is we take our results from our phase 2, in which we calculated these consensus prestige scores. And in our survey then for these households, we give people a food frequency questionnaire in which we ask specifically about each of these items and their consumption over the last 2 weeks. And then we multiply that or weight that by the consensus score. And so consumption of more dietary prestigious foods actually increases your prestige score. And then we do the same thing for behaviors. We ask people how often they engaged, and we list off the entire set of behaviors, and we can link them to their consensus scores as well. And so we can come up with a context of consumption score, which is telling us something about how well people are achieving these normative and aspirational behaviors in that particular context. And these seem to work, sort of. If we look at household wealth here, this is for the Ethiopian sample, and this is looking at the context of consumption score. We see that wealthier households are scoring higher on that. That's what you would expect. That is that they're engaging in more of these behaviors that are considered to be normative for wealthier households. They're essentially scoring more points in doing these behaviors that are seen as potentially prestigious. And poorer households are doing more behaviors, either more behaviors that are associated with poverty, struggle, et cetera, or are not engaging in some of these higher prestige behaviors. And we see the same thing for dietary prestige. When we calculate household level dietary prestige, we see that wealthier households are indeed consuming more prestigious diets. You can show that even when you control for the total number of items that they're consuming, their average prestige score is just higher, which again is what we would expect. That's sort of what the theory is leading us to expect, and we see that. Although there's a lot of noise in the data, which is interesting. And not only do these vary in a consistent way like we would expect with wealth, they vary with food insecurity. Rather than showing you for both Brazil and Ethiopia, I'll just put in bold the site from which these data are from. So this is Brazil, showing that as at household level food security declines, so does the dietary prestige score. And this is again what we would expect if dietary prestige is mediating this relationship between food insecurity and mental health. So we're beginning to see this. And so we see that for dietary prestige, and we see it for the context of consumption score. Again, that's just telling us that severely food insecure households are either engaging in fewer of these kind of high prestige behaviors or more of these low prestige behaviors. They're getting this weight. So we see that. All right. So at this point, we have kind of everything we need to test these two hypotheses, a nutritional hypothesis and a cultural hypothesis. We have data on BMI and anemia and arm fat area for the nutritional side, and we have data on the cultural value of the diet and the consumption. And so we can begin to actually test these two. And this is where things go south pretty quickly, but we can test these two things. So just to start, what we wanted to do was just make sure we can replicate the often shown association between food insecurity and our measure of mental disorders. And so these are data from Ethiopia, although you get exactly the same thing in Brazil. And it's just simply, it's a negative binomial model. It doesn't really matter. It's basically a regression model showing that food insecurity is positive and highly significant and predicting common mental disorders. So, and that's true when we control for all kinds of other things in the household. This is not news at the front at this point. This is like the 900th article or thing to show that there's an association between these two things. But it's good that we find it, otherwise there's really no point. So we find this. We can then turn to the nutritional hypothesis and see if the food insecurity common mental disorder link is mediated at all by the nutritional parameters or the nutritional variables we have. In the bivariate data, the quick ones suggest that it's very unlikely that's going to be the case. We've, in both Brazil and Ethiopia, the association between food insecurity and any of our nutritional measures is fairly small and inconsistent. So this is looking at just body mass index raw data between Ethiopia and Brazil, between household food insecurity and respondents' BMI. And maybe it's negative tiny bit in Ethiopia, and maybe it's a tiny bit positive in Brazil, but the effects are incredibly small, and certainly, and they go in opposite directions if they are significant. So, and this is not an uncommon finding when we look at food insecurity and BMI across different places these days. Now, maybe there's a little bit more when we look at anemia. This is, again, just looking to see if the nutritional parameters or variables move in the direction we would expect with food insecurity. And there's this dose-response relationship between anemia and insecurity in Ethiopia. You get a rising rate of anemia as severe food insecurity, as insecurity increases. But there's no consistent pattern in Brazil between food insecurity and anemia. And so all this suggests this is probably not going to be a variable that mediates the relationship, but we can dump it into a regression model and just test it to really convince ourselves. And so this is regression models in Brazil and Ethiopia trying to predict symptoms of anxiety and depression. And there's just no effect at all for anemia or BMI on either of these. We can maybe do a bit fancier one and put an arm fat area, which might be a little bit better in anemia, and none of these do anything. They don't mediate the relationship between food insecurity at all. In fact, if you saw it, the coefficient for food insecurity without these is 0.07, and with these it's also 0.07, and there's just no mediation whatsoever. So I would like it to be, we're at this point in the talk, I say, then we add in our cultural variables and we get these really amazing effects. But our next step is then to add in our cultural variables to these regression models. And that there's just absolutely nothing whatsoever. They don't mediate the relationship between food insecurity and common mental disorders at all. That there's really nothing there, even though food insecurity is associated with those, household wealth is associated with those. Our ethnographic data suggests those are potentially meaningful, but we absolutely get nothing. So we're left spending our Friday Zoom and learning that our results don't support either pathway here. And I think it's actually fairly interesting because I felt like we have quite a good ethnographic rationale for theorizing this cultural pathway. But I got to say, for an anthropologist who's somewhat committed to the importance of meaning, I find it a little bit shocking, to be honest, that we don't get anything. You know, and anthropologists, and particularly nutritional anthropologists, are famous for saying that food is important because of its biological and its social significance. And so we've really tried to capture the biological significance through things like BMI, but also the social significance. And we don't really get anything. So it's worth, I think, thinking a little bit about why we don't get anything. And one reason is perhaps we've just measured food insecurity wrong. And I think this is possible, but we use a measure that's been, it's a fairly standard tool. The psychometric properties in both of the sites on this measure are quite good. It varies with wealth. It predicts things like meat consumption. It's been used in other studies in Ethiopia and Brazil. So I'm not entirely sure that that's it. We could also quibble with the nutritional measures. We've used these fairly crude proxies here, and perhaps it would be better to have dietary studies in which we can actually calculate something like micronutrients, particularly things like iron and zinc would be good. But that is incredibly challenging, and particularly when people are eating from a common plate. We just felt like we weren't going to be able to do it, particularly on the sample size that we would need to have done it on. And so that leaves us with this cultural path. And I've been trying to think a little bit. I've got some, I got some thoughts about why the cultural path doesn't really do anything. One idea is that, we'd kind of envision that people are moving from a market like this. There's this tremendous infusion of foreign direct investment to markets like this, in which foods are as much about their ingredients as about meaning. And it may be that just these sites are not there yet. And so we don't have that really strong link between meaning and food. These sites just might not be that far along in the nutrition transition. Our ethnographic data suggests that people definitely connect food and meaning. Another possibility, though, is that for our cultural pathway, we've just measured the wrong pathway. We focused on food and meaning, but perhaps it has more to do with social roles. So Barbara Piperata has just published a very nice paper looking at pathways linking food insecurity and maternal distress, basically the same question, in Nicaragua, and she uses focused group data. And one of the things that comes out of that is that many of the mothers, this was all mothers in this, talked about how they feel like they're unable to fulfill their societal role or their normative role as a mother, and that is what is inherently stressful about this. So it might be that it's less about the meaning of foods and more about the meaning of social roles, and perhaps there's a failure or inability to achieve normative social roles about what it means to be a husband or a mother or a provider, and that's what's particularly stressful about this. Adjudicating between these two hypotheses, though, I think is quite important because they have entirely different implications for things like interventions. And solving the nutritional one, for instance, might have very little effect on the cultural one. And so some interventions may improve nutritional well-being, but not actually impact on meaning, and therefore you might still get this mental health effect here. So, and let me just conclude by saying, I think that there's always, of course, a third hypothesis, which is that culture doesn't matter at all. And we're just, as anthropologists, we're trying to bark up this tree, but there's nothing there. And I'll just quote my colleague and anthropologist friend, Dan Hrushka, who points out that although anthropologists are very keen on it, and learned beliefs and values and behaviors can have profound effects on health outcomes, that might not always be the case. And in many cases, cultural factors may matter much less than other influences. So it may be that there is actually no meaning effect here, even though anthropologists are sort of biased to look for that. So let me conclude then by saying what I've already said, which is that we find an evidence of an association between mental well-being and food insecurity. And the literature has kind of put forward these two different pathways through which that might happen. But we find no relationship between our nutritional variables. And even though we can show strong intra-site consensus on dietary prestige in the context of consumption, those variables don't explain the association between food insecurity and mental well-being. And so there's a couple of different directions the future research should go, but I think that probing meaning might actually be, I think there's some ways to do this in a little bit more sophisticated ways. And I think that's probably where this literature is going to go, because it's a literature that's just taken off trying to understand food insecurity and mental health. So I'll stop there and thank you all for your time and listening to me on Zoom. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Craig. That was fantastic. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A if you would like me to read them, or your name in the chat. And we do have one in the Q&A to start off with. So the question is, I'm wondering if you had any thoughts about an intermediary between nutrition and social meaning. So a more proximal psychological meaning. Food insecurity changing how people understand their physiological relationship with food. For example, I don't trust my body's sensations of hunger or negative affect emotion, leading to hypervigilance about the body or the body of loved ones, leading to poor mental well-being.
Yeah, Mallory, that's a great question. And I wouldn't have put it in such articulate terms as that, but I think we see that come out of the ethnographic, particularly of our semi-structured interviews. There are a lot of people who say things like, I'm eating this poor diet. And it's honestly, if you kind of did a nutritional analysis of it, it's probably a quite good diet, and there's lots of lentils and injera. It's quite good, but people talk about how it's essentially eroding their ability to interpret their body and their bodily reactions. I don't know if anybody's linked it specifically to hypervigilance, but there definitely is this idea that I'm eating this diet and it's it's preventing me from some sort of feeling the way I think I should feel. A lot of people talk about it as particularly it's making me tired. Maybe it might be worth us going back through to look for things like hypervigilance, but something broadly along the lines of what you're asking, it definitely seems to come out of our interviews. Yeah, good question.
So the next question is Chris Nicholas, if you want to unmute yourself and ask.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can, yeah, thanks.
Wonderful, thanks for the presentation, really fascinating. I wonder if you use the multidimensional scaling data, because I'm wondering if the mechanism might not be nutritional status or perceived prestige, but is it the strategies you have to engage in to procure food, and how that might lead to stress? So, because it sounds like you have a lot of action-based data from the POW source, so that'd be interesting.
Yeah, I think, this Christopher?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, Christopher, I think that, yeah, that's great. I think that's, we had tried to, think about this as kind of like these packages of ideas and behaviors. But I think you're right. I think like, sending your kids to the neighbor's house is, I think, more stressful than, for instance, maybe sitting at a holiday alone. One of them is very public. You're sending your kids out. Begging is the same thing. So I think kind of mining our data to look for those action items might be a way to really figure out if there's certain items that actually are potentially are driving an association getting swamped by other ones. Yeah. So, we've kind of shied away from just kind of dumping every one of those variables in and looking for a correlation. But I think you're right that we can look for particular behaviors and see if there's an effect there. That's what you're suggesting?
Yeah, that helps a lot. Thanks.
Yeah.
So there's a question from Joy Noel Baumgartner. Given that there are likely multiple causal pathways, how much do you think is psychological? Anxiety, living with uncertainty, lack of ability to build resistance. In Ghana, we saw men talking about poverty anger, which manifested as interpersonal violence because they said they couldn't handle the stress of not being able to provide for their families, which then led to their partner's maternal depression, and that it was very cyclical.
Yeah, Joy, let's see, so how much do we think this is psychological? Yeah, I think there's a big psychological component. See, I'm not entirely sure how to answer this question except to say, yeah, in our interviews, let me say this, in our interviews, which we tried to focus on things like food, they invariably talked about things like living with uncertainty, the lack of ability to build resilience, about political stuff that was happening in Ethiopia at the time, about labor markets that were biased against her. I mean, people connected food to all of these other uncertainties, anxieties. So yeah, I think there's a tremendous psychological component here. And that's the thing I wish we probed a little bit more. We focus so much on food that I wish we thought a little bit more about kind of the wider meanings of that. I mean, even more about the meanings of different foods, because I think we sort of tried to so tightly link specific food to a specific prestige score, for instance. But I think people use food to talk about many other things, and that probably would have been more important. Yeah. So how we would have quantified that, that's the kind of research we come from, is we need to quantify everything. I'm not sure how we would have done it, but I think I don't know if I'm talking specifically to your point here, but I think there's a tremendous psychological component. Yeah. Joy, you can interject too if I didn't actually, if I completely missed your question here.
So other questions in the chat or Q&A, I'm going to use the pause and questions to selfishly ask one myself, which was one of the things that I was thinking as you were talking about nutrition, was nutritional interventions, and how we know that so many of the interventions around trying to improve child stunting don't work. And kind of your, if you've seen this in literature, your thoughts about, is that because the focus is really on changing the foods or on changing the diet, and that we're not thinking about the prestige values of foods or the meanings of foods, and potentially even contributing to poor maternal mental health as being a recipient of these foods?
Yeah. Okay. So, Amanda, I think it's a great question, and I don't have. I think that some of these interventions, which are just aimed at increasing, for instance, calories, are really heading towards a nutritional goal and not fulfilling this cultural goal at all. And if there is something to this cultural side, then those could, yes, either not do anything, at least for mental health. And if mental health is linked to parenting behaviors, as it seems to be in some cases, they're not going to have that impact. And then, yeah, so you could actually be providing certain kinds of foods or even that are going to have no benefit for the mental health pathway whatsoever. Yeah. Now, on the other hand, I think there are some studies coming out of Ethiopia showing that when you do these kind of agro interventions and you do increase people's food insecurity, their levels of depression do go down. So I don't think it's, what I think is probably going on is a little bit of both. And I think context is going to make a difference there. But I think there are certainly some cases where you could provide food / just straight, you're just trying to increase energetic availability, and it might do nothing for the cultural pathway whatsoever. And you might see fewer gains from your intervention than you would expect. Yeah, yeah.
Thanks. There's another question from Angela.
Mm-hmm.
Is I'm wondering if you considered the alternate pathway from poor mental health to food insecurity rather than from food insecurity to poor mental health. For example, are people with mental health disorders less likely to be employed, more likely to be socially isolated with weaker social ties, which could then lead to greater food insecurity?
Yeah, that was a fantastic question. And this is one that I think plagues the massive literature right now in food insecurity and mental health. It's almost all of it's cross-sectional. But there are some longitudinal studies, and there are some studies of intervention studies now that seem to suggest that that it certainly can go both ways, but sort of at the population level, it's going from food insecurity to poor mental health. And so we see this, for instance, when there's shocks to a household or an economic crisis that suddenly increases food insecurity, what we see is that mental health will potentially go down. Now, that's of course not the case in every household, but I think when we kind of do these larger surveys, we're capturing more of that. But that is, I think, precisely the kind of work that needs to be done, is to do some longitudinal work looking at that. And we've done that a little bit, and we've looked at seasonal environments too, where we know in a seasonal environment, food insecurity goes up and down, and we can show that people who are doing quite well in terms of mental health early on then hit these seasonal bumps in food insecurity, and their mental health declines, and then it rebounds on the other side, which suggests the arrow is going from food insecurity to mental health. But certainly we know that that's not always the case. Yeah, but that's a great question. I think you can chime in if I didn't quite get your question correctly. I don't think as I did. All right.
And we likely have time for one more question if there is one more. Yes, letting you off the hook easily without the last last question. So thank you so much for this presentation and for being willing to speak with our students after this. I know they're really looking forward to it. So thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Yeah, have a great weekend.